Thank you very much. If I can permit myself a brief comment before we open it up. What I miss from these wonderful two panels so far is some more general skepticism towards sanction regimes. Now, I admit I come to that skepticism because of my skepticism, strategic and normative, with respect to the BDS movement in this country. I'm sure that many of the other panel members share that skepticism. Interestingly, in their case, it doesn't seem to lead them to more general doubts about sanction regimes. And most of the arguments in favor of them, not all, so far that we heard, seem to stress effectivity. But I think Judge Goldstone put that matter into perspective, which I think we can accept, but it also relativizes the point. Namely that in South Africa, at least, the sanction regime was only one component of a complex in which there are many other factors. I would add other factors, by the way. The ANC began to be transformed into a more democratic, and in a way more liberal organization too, during the 1980s, even before the fall of the Soviet Union. And in my experience, in my reading, I can see that lots of National Party, especially younger members, were changing in the 1980s too. And there must be a lot of other factors too. So in that constellation, he said, well, yes, sanction regimes mattered, but to what extent, what the causal role, he did not want to say. I had much more doubt about the causal argument for Poland, by the way, where I think the sanction regime was an even smaller matter, given the Gorbachev era and given the existence of a vast mass movement unparalleled almost anywhere in the world at that time, which were pushing for transformation. Yes, the sanction regime may have mattered, but only to some extent. So I think effectivity is not going to be the card. So I think I have to return to the matter of legitimacy. Now, when it comes to legitimacy, there's some really important doubts which I think are worth expressing. For example, are the violations themselves on the side of the country to be sanctions produce the legitimacy? But if that were the case, the whole discussion of Iran would run into a performative contradiction in relationship to the BDS movement, which is not, by the way, about Israel's nuclear weapons, but Israel is one country in the Middle East which already has proliferated up to about 400 nukes. And I think, you know, if one wanted to say Iran represents a threat to the nuclear peace of the world, then a country which already has it would represent an even greater threat. Substantive arguments, I don't think I'm going to make it. So I want to mention what are the formal arguments I heard, and I heard some especially from Judge Goldstone, which I sympathize with, but which raise problems. He said, I think this was really interesting, the discussion with Helene Sussman, where she, an anti-apartheid activist in the Democrat Party, with whom you otherwise probably sympathized, was against the regime. And you said, well, if the movement itself, the black movement itself, is for the sanctions, who are you? You said very well. Who are you to say no to that? And I accept that argument. I have not met an Iranian yet on the opposition, and I see many through our students, who supports the sanction regime. And you yourself, in relationship to Iran, produced that interesting card, which the one person here raised, which, with respect to the Iranians, said free the people who are under house arrest. With respect to the United States, it said end the sanction regime. That is the position of every major leader of the Green movement. They are opposed to the sanction regime. So if that is going to be the criterion, it's tough to apply to Iran. Multilateralism is the other point I think that several of you have made. And that, I think, with me carries quite a lot of weight, because if I think, as I do, that sanctions represent just a step short of an act of war, act of economic warfare, then I think it becomes a matter for the international community to play a role in establishing sanction regimes. So in those cases where you do have a Security Council resolution, I don't like coalitions of the willing because of a macabre act that we performed during the Iraq War. But still, if you have a multiple set of countries with different interests supporting a sanction regime, certainly it is better than a unilateral one. But, as you said yourself, in the case of Iran, most of that sanction regime has been unilateral, and a significant component of it remains unilateral too. So if we adopt that normative criterion, then I think we should actually reject unilateral sanction regimes. We should be opposed not just to one of them, but to all of them. So I think that I'll open the floor, but I think a little more doubt about sanction regimes, unless we support really all of them, where we find injustice on the other side. And in that case, lots of people here who are opposed to it would have to actually support, unlike myself, the BDS movement, which finds plenty of injustice on the side of the Israeli occupation, as well as other acts of the Israeli state. So with that, I will open up the floor to your questions. Ma'am.
My name is Marion Lipschitz. As I said, when I asked a question of the previous panel, I'm very concerned about human rights issues. I'm a member of both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. I'm a member of both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and it is in that context that I would like to ask Justice Goldstone about his perspective on certain comparisons that are made by some sectors of the left in criticizing Israel between Israel and South Africa. I'm sure it comes as no surprise to anyone who follows debates about Israel and about BDS that in some quarters it is popular to claim that Israel is an apartheid state. As someone who was intimately involved in the anti-apartheid movement, I wonder what your perspective is on that.
Erin, should we collect questions, or should we answer them one by one? All right, let's for a while answer them one by one, and then once we get maybe into this for about 10 more minutes or so, then we'll have a group of questions, and then the panel will end it. So Dr. Goldstone.
Well, the question about Israel and apartheid, I've never liked the analogy because I think there are so many differences between the two situations. And the analogy is used really for political reasons, not for any academic justice. There's really no academic justification, in my view, between the comparisons. I just don't like the comparison. I think it's unhelpful. I think it's used certainly by many in the BDS movement to align their case with the anti-South Africa sanctions and to benefit from the pariah status that was visited on South Africa.
But I mean, I'm sure you would grant that even if it's not apartheid, the international law of occupation does not allow an occupation to last forever.
No, I think they're in some respects the situation is in some ways worse than
in South
the
Africa.
Apartheid system, and in some areas it's certainly not as bad. But I don't think that there's any.
Okay, but with respect to the areas where it's worse, would you, in terms of the question, support anything resembling boycott, divestment? I mean, that's the question that is being asked. Well, apartheid is just an analogy which you use or you don't use.
I don't think I can put it any differently to the way Aria did. I think the BDS movement, for the most part, has a huge anti-Israel bias and doesn't take into account the human rights violations being committed, for example, in Gaza against the communities, in Gaza, non-Hamas entities, and I think they'd be doing themselves a lot of good if it was more even-handed.
Very good, sir.
Nimr Sultani of University of London. I also wanted to ask Professor Goldstone if you can elaborate on a couple of points that you mentioned briefly. The first one is your sense of discomfort and embarrassment Because one of the arguments against boycotts is that they also hurt the progressives in the white society, because the right-wingers and the conservatives will not be boycotted by conservatives in other places in the world who are against the boycott anyway. So did you feel that it weakened you and your fellow progressives in South Africa at the time? And if it did, do you think it's justifiable? Secondly, what's the general effect? Was it counterproductive in terms of the white society itself in sense of alienating it? So did it do what Dan Dresner said, that it break down dialogue, or does it do what Ari Nair said, that it will spur debate within white society? And thirdly, with respect to your final comment, and also this is something that Ari Nair said, at the time, did you or fellow progressives condition the boycott movement or the support for the black struggle on the equal condemnation of ANC crimes?
Again, I had trouble hearing.
Okay, so his question is, since we know from the Truth Reconciliation process there are also ANC crimes, and ANC admitted and even talked about some of those, did you at that time, when you supported the boycott there, in the argument with Mrs. Sussman, did you raise the question of are we being equitable, because after all there are also ANC crimes?
Well, you know, the ANC crimes were not, were really almost insignificant in comparison to what the apartheid system was doing to some 35 million or 30 million black South Africans. So I don't think there was any comparison. And certainly the only ANC crimes that I can recall being discussed were some situations of civilians being targeted, unfortunately, in some of the bombs that ANC freedom fighters exploded in a shopping centre in Durban, in a bar in Cape Town. But the ANC leadership was very forthright in condemning those incidents and stating that they were not consistent with the ANC policy of protecting civilians and going against government targets. So I think it's a question of proportionality in that respect, and there can be no question as to the justification for the overwhelming majority of black South Africans who opposed the oppression that was visited upon them.
Thanks. Anybody else? Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Katzenstein, and this is a question for Suzanne Maloney. First, thank you for your very comprehensive analysis of the Iranian sanctions regime. In terms of extrapolating lessons for other sanctions regimes, can you comment a little bit about kind of the U.S. using its financial power in the case of Russia or North Korea, and where you see that going in the future? Is this a one-time case of the U.S. kind of conditioning access to the U.S. market for national security purposes, or do you see kind of this becoming a broader policy?
If I could, I would hand the mic to Dan Dresner in the audience, because I think that's really a question that he would...
Could you just pull it a little closer to yourself?
I was saying I would hand the mic. Obviously, I would want him to speak into it directly to Dan Dresner. But I'll just say a quick word, and then maybe he'll comment. I think that it's been remarkable how these designations have been used, and the success with which they have been used. I know prior to the first listing of an Iranian bank back in 2006 under one of these statutes or one of the executive orders, there was real concern about the use of this kind of power of the U.S. financial system and how it might be taken by the broader international community within the U.S. government. There was an actual debate before Banca Sadarat was designated in 2006 about how this would be viewed. It was, of course, modeled on the very discreet and I would imagine that Marcus Nolan may discuss this tomorrow, use of similar authorities against a North Korean financial institution, and the success there, or at least the perceived success there, was what facilitated the decision to move against Iran. But there were those already saying this may produce a backlash, this may lead to many looking to put their assets in forms other than the US dollar, many, particularly in China, considering the construction of a sort of alternative financial system, which would be somewhat distinct from and immune to the reach of the US financial system. And I think the success, incremental and then of course comprehensive as these measures were applied to the entire Iranian financial system, really overrode most of those concerns with respect to Iran. And of course, it's a dangerous model as it has been used as you know, a sort of simplistic model with respect to Russia, which is a much more complicated economy and much more integrated in the international financial system than Iran's was prior to the application of these measures. And so I think, you know, it's becoming much more of a debate. I see it much more in the kind of policy community. I don't know what the conclusions of that debate are at this stage, and I would encourage Dan to comment if he can get to a mic.
I'll pay you the $20 later, Suzanne, but thank you. I actually do have a question, but in response to that one, I would say, the other thing you have to think about with financial sanctions is that one of their origins was also the anti-money laundering initiative that started with actually the late Clinton administration and the first part of the Bush administration. And I think one of the things that surprised Treasury officials was how successful that was in getting a whole lot of jurisdictions to improve their standards, in no small part because the threat was, even just the hint of a threat that they might be cut off from the US financial system really had a pronounced effect. And so I think that this is one of these things that US officials are starting to learn. The question is whether there's going to be that blowback. And while I articulated the fear about, you know, China setting up an alternative to the US dollar, it's also worth pointing out that there's actually not a ton of evidence that that's going to happen anytime soon, and that there are real problems with actually trying to do that from the Chinese perspective. So as much as there's this sort of sympathy for that, it's also not clear at what point you will hit that. And the other problem is that if it does happen, it's going to be a very discontinuous shift. It's not going to be this sort of slow movement, so that's one of the tricky things. But I would also have a question for Andrew Arado, actually, which is you've been pushing a lot this notion that the reason that sanctions work isn't because of their relative cost, it's because of their legitimacy. And I'm not entirely sure.
That's not what I said.
Then what did you say?
Legitimacy matters independently whether it works or not.
I'm not sure I understand what that means.
You don't? Well, maybe you should read Max Weber.
I understand the notion that sanctions can be legitimate or not.
That's right.
But the question is, but you're arguing that we shouldn't care about efficacy at all?
We should care about legitimacy a lot. For example, when a country like the United States, which has interests, geopolitical interests in a region, imposes sanctions supposedly on the basis of human rights, but in fact is serving many, many other interests, we should have some doubt about it. I said when, for example, a panel like the Security Council, which has the power of veto on very different sides, agrees to the same sanctions, I think it has greater legitimacy. I didn't say that, therefore, they will work better. I just said that I would support them more because of the legitimacy issue. I also said with Dr. Goldstone that if the movement itself that is fighting for liberation within a country supports sanctions, I would consider them to be more legitimate. I didn't say anything about the effectivity, which I think is relatively small in the case of Poland, almost non-existent. In the case of South Africa, probably bigger, more important, but still part of a constellation. So I say effectivity is in fact not very good. And therefore, I'm interested in the question of legitimacy, where we're talking about normative issues as ends in themselves. Maybe that's too foreign a notion for you, that normative issues should be ends in themselves.
Oh, no, I certainly think normative issues should be an end in themselves.
I hope I can persuade you that you should think that way.
Well, I would also like to persuade you about the relative effectiveness of them, because I'm not entirely sure.
Well, because you counted a lot of cases, you think that has actually gave you the causal relation, or what?
We can have this debate further if you want, but to be blunt, yes. I've taken a look at the entire data set, and I can tell you.
Those things.
What?
I don't have too much trust.
So you don't trust data, is what you're saying? I
don't trust multiple regressions, which could be explained on the basis of the fact that there are external
that was what I wanted to know.
Explain the reason why the things correlate that correlate.
Got it. Thank you.
You're at the new school, by the way. You should remember that. No, it doesn't make you right. But being on the side of the American government doesn't make you right either.
Not on the side of the American government.
You are.
American government would probably be surprised to hear that.
Is it possible to be too big to have sanctions having an effect upon you? I'm thinking about, the Pope in the Renaissance. He'd excommunicated half the population of Europe. And I'm thinking of a large place like China, if you're trying to do, or the United States. How effective can it be? The best example, probably historically, would be the Roman Empire. Did anyone ever get an opportunity, maybe Carthage did, I don't know, where they did something that hurt such a large, wide-scale, trade routes, everything, empire? This is a question.
I don't know what you said. Maybe somebody else does.
You're talking about, is China too big to be sanctioned? Is that what you're saying? Well,
That's more or less true.
it depends.
It's more or less true. I think same for Russia, by the way.
Well, I think if you use targeted and so-called smart sanctions, then it's not, the object is not so big. But sanctions are a matter of power. I mean, I think perhaps the misunderstanding between you and Dan is, if we discuss it under the rubric of power, is power ever legitimate?
Yes.
Ah,
Yes.
okay.
For example, liberal democratic power is legitimate.
So if we vote in our liberal democracy to put sanctions on somebody, that would be legitimate?
That would make it more legitimate than if it is imposed by a secret committee somewhere.
All
Yes,
right.
I would say that. And I think you probably believe that too.
So
fair.
this is in connection, this is a question for Professor Arado in connection to Dan's questions. Professor Arado, I would have, from what you said before Dan spoke, I would have thought that you were pretty much completely against sanctions.
Could you speak a lot? I'm kind
Yeah,
of
sure.
deaf.
Before Dan spoke, I would have thought that, from what you said previously, that you were completely against sanctions.
I didn't say that.
I know you didn't say that, but I would have thought that. So I'm going to ask you this. When and where should sanctions be applied, if ever? So I'm going to ask you pointedly.
Okay.
Do you think that there's any
Okay.
case
If
where
if the substantive issue is big enough, if there is some chance of effectivity, and if it is imposed in a legitimate way by a legitimate group of states, then I would say that there may be an argument for sanctions. That would be my answer to your question. Is that an answer that you particularly dislike, or is that one that you like, or what?
And remember where you are, the new school.
I'm at the new school, but then I get to
No, I
ask
just
the-
want to know. I
then-
want to know whom
then-
I'm speaking to.
Then I
know.
get
We
to ask the
have,
question is who watches the watchers? Who gets to make those determinations? I mean, you raise wonderful points, but then I think you make a conclusion that's not really consistent with the points that you raised.
Why not?
Because you're putting people in power to make those choices, and what are the circumstances? It's so subjective that
We didn't make them absolute monarchs of this country, right? That's even the U.S. Supreme Court said, right, in Hamdan or Hamdi, I'm not sure in which case, that our president is not an elected absolute monarch.
But it's dealing with trade with other countries.
Actually, I was quite interested in what Andrew has said in relation to the legitimacy of sanctions as being very important. I'm going to talk about the African sanctions tomorrow, but one of the things that raises a serious question of legitimacy is when the sanction sender sends sanctions with very, very different and inconsistent values. On the one hand, you support dictatorships and you don't have any problem with supporting a dictatorship in terms of putting sanctions. On another, you claim to put sanctions on countries that you claim they are dictators. You would have a sanction on Zimbabwe, but you don't have a sanction on a bunch of African countries who are dictatorships. Now, that raises a very serious question about legitimacy. I mean, what is the basis upon which sanctions can be legitimized if the sanction senders themselves are not consistent in terms of what they really want? you know, one of the issues that is making it very difficult for, at least in the African cases.
The Nuremberg Tribunal already rejected the tu quoque argument, which unfortunately I seem to imply in an earlier remark. So the fact that there's a lot of racism in the United States does not make the United States unable to act on behalf of rights elsewhere. That would be one important point. So that means that even if one could show that some of the countries themselves are guilty of human rights violations who impose sanctions, that in itself for me does not delegitimate them. But inconsistency does, which is one of my problems with the BDS. There are lots of states in the Arab world where all the things they describe are actually worse than in Israel. So why do you single, and that's where the suspicion of anti-Semitism comes in, even if it's not justified, why do you single out that particular state? So I think that, yes, I think other states matter, but unfortunately not the country's human rights situation or political structure which is imposing it. The Soviet Union, I think, was quite right in judging National Socialist war crimes in spite of Katyn, and in spite of Katyn maybe not, because Katyn they actually put on the conto of the Germans, but actually they committed the crime themselves. But they were it was quite all right for them to play the role of judge and even prosecutor in some of the Nuremberg tribunals, in spite of the fact that Stalinism is no better from many points of view than National Socialism. But I think the important thing is to apply these things consistently.
That's, I think, the legitimacy question. I think that's where you know, when you have hundreds of thousands of people being kicked out of their land in Africa, and you don't put that sanctions on them, but in Zimbabwe, when whites are kicked out of their lands, then it becomes a legitimate case for sanctions. Then that raises a very serious problem to people who otherwise would have supported sanctions against dictatorships when you start to have these different, cases. That's why I thought the point that you're raising about the legitimacy of sanctions is.
But some people don't like that issue. Usually because they're so doubtful, secretly they're doubting the legitimacy of what they're doing. Please. That's it?
Yep.
Okay, that's it.
All right.